The date of the report is 24th of January 2018 and issued under the name of the Divisional Commissioner Detective Service. On the status of the investigation, it records that to date the investigation team can account to 144 deaths, a total of 45 inquest dockets and 99 inquiry files. Inquiry files were registered for bodies that were already buried when the investigating team was established. The investigation of these inquest dockets and files are at an advanced stage. However, during the arbitration proceedings, the investigation team established from testimony of certain witnesses information that will necessitate registering of other criminal offenses. The matter was discussed with the National Prosecuting Authority, and the investigating team was advised to await the finalization of the arbitration proceedings in order to obtain the entire transcripts, audio and visual recordings. The investigation team is working in conjunction with the National Prosecuting Authority. On 2018, January 10, all inquest dockets and files were handed to the NPA for perusal and further directives. All the inquest dockets and inquiry files are still with the Office of the National Prosecuting Authority. Progress will be reported. That's the end of the status discussion. Thank you, Justice Msaneke.
Justice.
Thank you, Counsel. Advocate Utamo.
Thank you, Justice. There is a request which we would like to make. We would like to introduce a further witness for next week. We have communicated this to our learned friends, some of whom do not have any objection. There's been matters which have been raised relating to the finances of the province. We have found it prudent that we should call the MEC for Finance to be able to canvass those aspects which relate to finance. As the Justice has said, there is a need for an explanation of what actually happened to the funds which were allocated to the various NGOs. So on that basis, we found it necessary that the relevant official in the form of the MEC for Finance should be the appropriate person to be able to canvass those matters relating to the finance of the province, in particular in relation to matters concerning the health department. So with your permission, we just wanted to give an indication the order of the witnesses, the order of how we intend to call the witnesses for next week.
And what would the order be? Or you just about to tell me?
Okay. We intend calling the MEC for Finance on Tuesday, followed by the Premier of the province. We've scheduled 2 witnesses for Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we will be calling the current MEC for Health, who will then be followed by the National Minister of Health. That is the order in which we intend calling the witnesses. With your permission, we just wanted to alert all the parties of how we intend to run with the matter next week.
For my part, excellent. I think well done. Subject to the views of other counsel, that seems to be highly necessary, prudent, and I welcome it. But let's hear the views of other counsel on the matter. And this would be Ms. Barbara Christie.
It is indeed correct, Justice.
Yeah, very well. Counsel?
Justice, from our side, we're one of the parties that have not agreed or was not in favor of this. And our line of thinking are just the following. The budget lies within the MEC of Health. she's best suited to deal with that. If the MEC for Finance feels that there can be a contribution made, she can do that via an affidavit. We are concerned we need to prepare for such a witness, and we need to scratch further than just going to the NGO money if budgets are placed before us. We will need an expert to advise us how to do that. We're not sitting next week Monday, we're not sitting next week Friday. And this arbitration needs to have an end somewhere. We're not fighting that there were resource constraints within the department. We're not fighting with that the Minister of Health is saying there was enough money to care for the mental health care patients. The only issue that this court has raised is what happened to the NGO money. And in our submission, to bring in another witness and to create new disputes of fact is in this case going to prolong, because we'll have to have a chance to look through all the budgets and get expert evidence on that. It will just create new disputes of fact, which are not disputes of fact at the moment. And I submit that it might then have the result in having to prolong this arbitration, and that's our objection.
How would it prolong it? The 2 days were set aside will still be used?
Yes, but we will need time to look through the evidence, because it will be, the MEC can't just come here and make blanket statements. She will have to give financial statements, and we're not qualified to look through financial statements. We're not experts in that. We will need to let the matter stand down to obtain an expert to look at that. So that will cause a delay in the proceedings.
Well, I hear you. Let me hear the counsel. I'll come back to that. My prima facie view is different from that, but I'll come back to you. Once I've heard the views of everybody. Advocate Hassen.
Thank you, Justice. Good morning. First of all, Justice, I wasn't aware of this, so I'm hearing it for the first time now from my colleague. So I haven't had an opportunity to think it through and what the advantages and disadvantages of this would be. So from the top of my head, I would say that I have some reservation as far as time goes and preparation, as my colleague has herself raised. The Friday in particular next week, the day that we are not sitting, is the one day in which we have clear in order to finalize our written submissions, which we have to file the very next day. So the overflow, if we were to go into Friday, even though I appreciate that that day has been kept clear, will impact on our ability to, at the same time, prepare our written legal submissions. And that really is the main concern, is time and preparation, as far as the need to further interrogate the issues of the budget. The MEC for Health is coming. If there's a way to do it in a manner that will not impact on the time we have available, if that's at all possible. As I said, I haven't had a chance to think it through. I do think the issue of the budget and how the money was spent is important. And it is something we would like to have dealt with in the hearing. We would object to us flowing over into the Friday of next week.
Yes, thank you. Counsel? So you're not told until I was told?
I was not aware until it was raised now in relation to calling the witness or the impact on the schedule and the proposed schedule.
Counsel?
Justice?
I'll come back to you. Let me hear all counsel. You've raised the matter, so you're going to have the last word. The last word is yours, okay?
Justice Mseneke, in our view, the issues that the MEC for Finance will be bringing into these proceedings are quite limited. We already have her budget speech that deals with the issues that she ought to speak to. And if she comes here, she will certainly not be allowed to traverse other issues which do not fall within her mandate. The MEC can speak, that is on the issues that relates to her mandate, and Barbara Creasy would speak to the issues which have been defined by the budget speech in relation to these proceedings. So that the MEC will be coming here, then there might not be a need for us to even cross-examine her. So to assume that there will be a need to interrogate further the issues that it should be bringing in here, I think it might not be correct. But I think your participation in this might instead in my view, I think contribute. Add something in how the finances of the department were used, whether indeed it is correct that they were under financial constraints, whether it is correct that they had to cut the quality of services which the patients had ultimately received. So, in my view, that we need that part of the evidence because already we had the previous MEC, former MEC, who had emphatically said that they're under financial constraints. They had to cut services and so on. So we need to deal with that, interrogate that issue a little further. If that witness is available to assist us, Justice Msenek.
Yes.
Thank you.
You see, Advocate Groenewald, I'm coming to you. I'll go back and debate the matter with Advocate Krause. This whole factual trajectory here is premised on we had no money. And we had to do all of these things because we had no money. Advocate Krause spent a lot of time yesterday trying to demonstrate the rationality of the decision, let alone its implementation. MEC Creasy could demonstrate that in a few lines, not hours of cross-examination. She could show there was money, there was, and that reason would fall flat almost instantly. So if there's anything important in this case is why. I don't know why. And if the big lie is about money, then that's the big lie. And she can conclusively get us there. But the second thing, Advocate Groenewald, I want to know what happened to 190 million. All the other parties were very poor on numbers, and somebody came and said, here are the numbers. And I want to know about the cost savings that appear to have been anticipated. So you need somebody who's numbered, not just a politician, somebody who sits at the pot. And what did they do with the money? What happened to that 190 million? Where did they use it? On whom? How? To what effect? And why didn't it be used to save lives? Your submissions.
Thank you, Justice. We have indicated to my colleague for the state that we have no objection to calling the witness.
But why were your colleagues not given due notice?
Justice, I just wanted to apologize on that aspect. At the time when I was discussing the matter with my colleagues, she was not present at that time, but I had time to discuss the matter.
Who is she?
I was not able to speak to counsel on behalf of Section 27. But however, I had the opportunity to speak to the instructing attorney from Section 27. I took it that the instructing attorney will pass the message to counsel as she was not present at that time. And I just want to apologize that. It is the point which I actually wanted to raise. It was not intentional that I excluded her from my engagements as I did with other colleagues.
Yes. We all know those who have lived long, it always helps to ease out things and to give notice and to If you want your wife to go to the movie with you, you tell her sometime early. You don't walk in and say, we're going to the movie. Where now? You're in trouble, you're in big trouble. So it always helps to ease out things.
It is for this reason that I just want to apologize for not having had the time to speak to her. But I made effort that the instructing attorney is given notice of what we intended to present before you, Justice.
Very well. I'll go back to your colleague, but she has heard you apologize. Is there anything else you want to say on the substance?
We stand by the submissions that we have made that it is quite necessary given the issues involved. We have had a lot of testimony relating to financial constraints. So those are the matters that really need to be cleared. And what we want to emphasize is that the current MEC for Finance, Ms. Barbara Creasy, was holding the same position at the relevant period, subject to these proceedings. So in those circumstances, she will be the appropriate person to deal with matters which related to the tragedy. There's nothing further that...
And the current MEC is a doctor. Correct. So, I'll say nothing more. I don't know her skills about numbers, but I'll leave it there. Thank you. Advocate Krause, I come back to you because you have probably the most vehement position on the matter. I've expressed my prima facie view right up front. Counsel for the State probably did what they did, taking a cue from me, because I kept on saying that the MEC must come and explain this. And I think it's quite vital. There was a prima facie view, and I think it's now fairly well formed. Now, I still don't know why most of the patients here lost their lives.
Yes.
Given the connection between the death and the resources, that's probably the single most important cause of the devastation on lives of the survivors, on lives of those who lost their lives. And I want somebody to tell me about the money thing.
Yes. Justice, if I may, and I know it's very brave to go against the prima facie view of a judge, but unfortunately, I have to do what I have to do in these circumstances. I've just quickly looked at the MEC Finance. She's also not a finance person. So she's in no better position to advise on finances as the MEC for Health. That's
that's a very bold statement.
Well,
it's more bolder than the first one you proposed.
Yes, Justice, we just have the her education degree. We just looked at it very quickly, and it's not the finances.
People learn very quickly when they're in positions,
yes,
and they qualify themselves. No, I wouldn't lightly say that about a public official holding a position. I think we should be a little careful there.
Justice, it might be so that she has learned, but is she really an expert only on finances, or is she going to say, well, the CFO said this to me, and PricewaterhouseCoopers have prepared these papers?
But we don't know, and she's not called as an expert. She is head of finances,
yes,
so she's got statutory obligations, and she should be able to speak to those. And she writes up the budget with her staff. She delivers it. She speaks to it. And she should know how the numbers stack up in the budget and above it. More importantly here, how the money was used. So,
Justice, in terms of money, the money that flows from the Department of Health to, as I understand it, to the MEC of Health. So the MEC of Health gets the money from the national department. So she's the person that we say should come and account here. And we already have the statement of Creasy. So I really don't see why we should increase these witnesses just to come and say what she's already told the nation, and we
No.
accept that.
No, I need to hear much more than
Okay.
the one-liner that they don't cut costs around health care. I want to know what was the budget at the time. I want to know what was allocated for mental health care. I want to know whether it is true, whether they could afford to buy Life Esidimeni or not. I want to know what was the pressure of trying to save the money at that point.
Just
And
as
that will make the decision almost totally irrational and totally reckless if in fact it wasn't so. So I need that evidence so that I understand. And nobody has spoken to those numbers up to now.
but our understanding is that the MEC for health should do that, not the MEC for finance.
If I take your stance and down that route, she's not even the accounting officer. The HOD is the accounting officer.
Or the
So
chief financial
she-
officer.
Yeah, she's not the accounting officer of the department. So on the fine numbers, on the line items, you go and talk to the HOD. So I still think the globular understanding of the claimed financial pressure will be dissipated or will be confirmed by an MEC for finance.
Just as it's not for us to tell another party how to proceed with its case. But the only issue that we take at this, we don't think this witness is really necessary to put those things on the table. And we can do no more than saying it's a waste of
Yes.
resources. And that's the high watermark of our
You're
objection.
entirely within your entitlement, entirely. If a party has chosen to call a witness in arbitration, and that view coincides with that of the arbitrator that it's a necessary witness, I think you have a hard swim. You're swimming against the current.
Yes,
But you're entitled to swim against the current.
yes, Justice, that's
Yes.
my job.
Absolutely. Do you still want to speak? I see you're raising your, yes, Advocate Hassan. And just before we go to the question of time, I think the State Council has been careful to say it will be done in the 2 days already reserved. So I don't see extension, an undue extension of this proceeding. It is kept and it is defined within that time.
Justice, I don't believe that my learned friend for the state is right, is that it's going to be accommodated in that time. I was already concerned that we won't finish those witnesses that are before the arbitration at that time. But nobody has a crystal ball, but our prima facie view is that it
And
won't
then we
be.
sit longer, we put in more hours to finish. But we're going to finish in the 2 days. Council?
Justice, I'd like to respond to my colleague first and to say I accept the apology and I don't wish to make a bigger issue out of that at all. I also want to make it clear that we have no objection to the former MEC, to MEC Creasy appearing before the proceedings. We don't take issue with her qualifications to speak on the issues that we would like to hear on. So we have no objection to MEC Creasy appearing in order to give us that information. My concern was perhaps a mundane one, but important to us, and that is to stick to the timeframes. And if we are able to do so, then we'll be quite happy. And a discussion on how to manage time can take place outside of these this morning's proceedings during an adjournment with my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you for accepting the apology, and your position is understood. I think having heard all the parties and debated the matter, we certainly will have MEC Barbara Creasy coming on Tuesday next week, isn't it? And you're going to start with her in the morning, are you?
That's correct, Justice.
Yes. I think we should do so. And the issues are, Advocate Nguchala is quite right, the issues are crisp, they're narrow, they're defined. We're not doing an audit of the province. There are very specific issues we would like to understand in the light of this open-ended claim about money having been the true driver of this inhuman conduct.
Okay. Thank you, Justice, and thanks to the colleagues who have acceded to the request, as this will assist this process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Justice, if I just may interrupt, could you please make a ruling as to when supporting documents will reach us before our cross-examination on Tuesday of this witness?
Yes, I think that is fair, and that would be by Monday, not later than Monday at 9 a.m. In other words, if the MEC intends to use, it's Friday today, any documents to use and hand in should be made available to you and to the parties not later than 9 a.m. on Monday. If earlier, all the better.
Thank you,
And parties can work through them over the weekend. So if there are any documents she's going to hand in, they must be made available. And that will give the parties at least 24 hours in which to look at the documents.
We'll do so, Justice.
We'll do so. Is that in order?
I'm indebted to
Yes,
you,
very well.
Justice. Thank you.
Counsel, is that good?
Thank you, Justice.
Advocate Guchana, will that work?
It will work,
Also,
Justice.
we have consensus. Very well. We should come back then to what the business of the day.
Good morning, Justice. Justice, today we have Professor Grobler. Who will
Yes,
be
you and Ms. Stein, I almost thought you've lost your voices. But it's very good to hear you say something. I hope she'll say something before we adjourn. It's very important to keep one's vocal cords going. Otherwise, they fade like mine over many years of speaking. Yes, Advocate Ina?
I would like to request that an oath be administered.
Yes.
Thank you.
Professor Kwamla, we apologize. Lawyers do go backwards and forwards, as you've heard. We get paid to do exactly that. But thank you for being here. In which language do you want to testify?
In English, Justice.
In English. Would you swear that the evidence you are about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth? And if so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Very well.
Thank you, Justice.
Advocate
Good morning, Professor Grobler. Good morning, Professor
Good
Grobler.
morning, Advocate Tina.
I will be leading your evidence in chief. Before we start, I would like to request you to please state your qualifications for the record.
I obtained a degree, a Bachelor in Medicine Surgery in 1989, a Diploma in Occupational Health in 1993. I also became a Fellow of the College of Psychiatrists of South Africa and obtained the qualification FC Psych in 1997. I did my Master in Medicine in Psychiatry in 1997, and I became a Doctor of Medicine in Psychiatry in 2013.
And will you also please state your work experience briefly?
I've been a psychiatrist now for 20 years, Justice. The first 6 or 7 years was in private practice, then I went back to public service. I've also worked in Ireland for a year or two. For the past 5 years, 6 years, I've been working as the head clinical unit at Elizabeth Donkin Hospital in Port Elizabeth. 18 months of those 6 years, I was actually acting CEO of the hospital, and for the past 4 years, I've been member of the South African Medical Association's Human Rights Law and Ethics Committee.
Is there
Thank you, Justice.
any counsel who contests the specialist and expert position of Professor Grobler?
We don't dispute that this is an expert.
You accept
Justice.
his expertise
Yes.
and that he testifying as an expert.
Thank you, Justice. We've perused the qualifications of the expert, and we have no objection to his expertise.
Advocate Boulevard.
We do not dispute that this is an expert witness.
Yes.
Justice, we accept his expertise.
Very well. Let's then get to the substance of the evidence.
Thank you, Justice. Justice, just before we start, I would like to indicate that the report has been handed in as LR 136, and he also prepared a short affidavit about his qualifications and experience, which is marked LR 137. and the CV is ELA 138.
Thank you. These are before me.
Thank you. I will then proceed to take Professor Grobler through the report, which is ELA 136. Professor, I would like us to start from page 2, please.
I'm on page 2.
Yes, if you could briefly explain to us what you mean by if you could briefly give us an explanation of ethical principles in the health profession.
Justice, if it would please you, I'm going to read and then explain as time goes on.
Oh, yes.
Ethics deals with questions of right and wrong, good or bad, and our moral obligation towards others as well as ourselves. The importance of ethics cannot be understated as we make ethical judgments and decisions every day. These decisions we as individuals or collectively as groups make affect the people and the world around us, and for this reason it's important to examine the ethics involved in making such decisions, including our own ethics. Why ethics is important in this situation is that there were a lot of medical health professionals that were involved in decisions that adversely eventually affected the lives of patients. And all of them are held to certain ethical rules by the nature of the profession that they adhere to. So ethically, I need to understand, or I try to understand, how they reasoned or failed to reason to come to the decisions that they came to as mental health professionals and medical professionals in this situation.
Yes, on page 3, you have given examples of ethical principles. Can you just take us through those examples?
There are 4 ethical principles that are generally viewed as the 4 cornerstones of biomedical ethics. So when we talk about ethics in medicine, we refer to it as biomedical ethics. And these 4 are autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So autonomy means that every person has the right to be in charge of his or her own life and make his or her own decisions. And in other words, the ability of a person to act on his own free will. And you cannot think or reason about autonomy without thinking about informed consent. Informed consent means that you have to explain yourself to the patient. Now, doctors have a specific obligation to explain decisions and give patients information about decisions and about their disease. So when we talk about autonomy, in terms of people suffering from mental illness, we have to consider whether they had capacity or the capacity to understand the decisions that are being taken. And when I approached this report, after reading the Ombudsman's report, I tried to see where in this whole process was the service user, was the patient actually also consulted, and I don't know if I missed it, but I didn't see where they were consulted. I saw later on that the family started advocating on their behalf, and that's when things started getting hot, and also from SASOP and SADC and Section 27 side. So when it comes to autonomy, I'm wondering why the patients were not ever asked what their opinion was on this intended move, because they are surely the people who are going to move. Now, again, I have to give some context. So if my understanding is correct, I read one of the papers by Capri, about half of the patients were people with intellectual disability, living with intellectual disability. So that is a condition where one would assume that the ability to give consent would be fairly static. It won't change over time necessarily. And depending on the level of intellectual disability, there would be a decrease in the ability to give consent. I have to assume that the other half suffered from severe and enduring mental illness. Illnesses like schizophrenia, like severe bipolar mood disorder, dementia, other mental illnesses. And for patients with illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar mood disorder, their ability to consent may vary over time. So you cannot actually use only one point of reference to say that this will be the point of reference where I say this person has the ability to consent or not. So you must have the intention. Firstly, you must approach the person with respect. You must respect. You must not accept that this person does not have the capacity to consent. You must go from the premise as a medical doctor that this person possibly will have the capacity to consent. Then you will have to make sure that the person understands the concept that with which he or she is being confronted, and then there shouldn't be any manipulation or coercion involved in this process. So for these patients, it would have made sense for me that they should have been approached and asked, some of them at least, and said, we intend to relocate you. This is where you are living now, and let us go and show you where you're going to live. And would you make an informed decision? Can you decide which one of these two would you prefer to live? And for the life of me, I can't think that there were not at least some that could have actually expressed a view on this prior to all of this happening. And I want to give an example of the fact that people, even if you have severe enduring mental illness, you don't have the capacity to make certain decisions, but you might have capacity to make other decisions. So let's say you don't have the capacity to look after yourself in the community by living independently, going out, buying groceries, having a budget, taking care of your personal hygiene. You might not have that capacity, but when living in an institution, you might have the capacity to make certain decisions for yourself. If a person is confronted with a choice of would you like an orange or an apple for a snack, the person can make a choice. They have a preference, and I'm sure that the family members here will know that their families had preferences for certain things. So the person may say then, I would like to have the apple, please. But then informed decision comes in from the mental health care provider side, and I don't want to dismiss it as simple as that. But let's say the apple is rotten and the apples are old and the oranges are new and fresh. You then inform the person the apple is rotten, and if you eat it, you will get some nutrients, but you might get an upset tummy. Do you still want the apple, or would you prefer the orange? And the person may then change their mind, say, no, in that case, I think I would prefer the orange. So there are certain decisions that a person can take autonomously.
Are doctors entitled to assume without more whether in the case of intellectual disability or severe enduring mental disorder that the patient is incapable of making a choice or a selection or an informed decision?
The doctor can never just make that, even the treating doctor can never make that assumption. In my own practice, I can name numerous examples of being approached by family members. In one case, it was two family members that were in hospital, and they wanted to curatorship for both. And I couldn't assume that either of them had or hadn't. And in the end, I had to go at that point in time and do a capacity assessment and make sure that they understand the facts involved. So from my point of view, and in my opinion, a doctor can never just assume that the person does not have capacity. They need to always have respect for the person's autonomy.
And Professor Grobler, is there any relationship between the capacity to pay for the services of the doctor and the requirement of autonomy? The fact that the patients here were state patients and did not themselves, nor did their families pay, does that affect, reduce, or annihilate the entitlement to autonomy?
No, Justice, not in my view. I think it's actually two different things. So the fact that they're not paying, I don't think is part of the ethical reasoning when it comes to the person's ability to consent. What can maybe be construed as part is the fact that they are admitted under the Mental Health Care Act. And even then, when they are admitted under the Mental Health Care Act, and again, I'm going to make an assumption that all of these patients, if they were in Life Esidimeni, there's a statutory route that is followed, and there's a High Court document that states that they can stay in that facility. Even then, the doctor cannot assume that this person does not have capacity. Sometimes there are research projects, and there's in my affidavit, I referred to an article by Professor Barry Creer from the University of Pretoria, where he looked at consent for patients who were admitted under the Mental Health Care Act and their ability to give consent when taking part in research. So even a person admitted under the Mental Health Care Act that cannot function independently outside of this institution can, in the institution, give an informed consent as to whether they would want to participate in research or not. So I don't think that, yeah, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. If you could then take us to the next one, which is beneficence.
The difference between beneficence and non-maleficence is the fact that beneficence is an action and non-maleficence is inaction. So beneficence is an action that is done for the benefit of others, and beneficent actions can be taken to help prevent or remove harms or simply improve the situation of others. Healthcare practitioners are expected to refrain from causing harm, but they also have an obligation to help their patients. All efforts should be made to maximize the possible benefits whilst keeping the risks at a minimum. The principle of beneficence also bestows upon us a moral obligation to determine whether any actions would have truly beneficial consequences for our patients. It does not simply imply that our good intentions are a sufficient justification to action, rather that we have a duty to gather sufficient information and expertise regarding the possible ramifications our decisions could have on our patients, and also that for the future. And again, I hope I'm not giving too much context, just as I have a tendency to do that. So,
no, you're doing fine, and we're learning as you speak. Thank you.
Just going back for a moment to autonomy. So a paternalistic approach would be that father knows best, if I can put it that way. So there's the assumption that is made that the father, as head of a household, and again, these are all assumptions, and I do not want to offend anybody by approaching it in a certain way, but that the father knows best what is best for the children, and the father does not need to consult the children before taking decisions that has an effect on their life. So we can also, when it comes to beneficence, not just paternalistically assume that we know what is best for a person. The person still has to, we still have to go through a logical moral reasoning to come to a point where we say, okay, this action will be beneficial to my patient. Then non-maleficence means do no harm. So that is inaction. So just by doing nothing, sometimes we prevent harm from happening. And the pertinent ethical issue is whether the benefits outweighs the burdens. First, do no harm is one of the core principles of medical ethics. In every situation, healthcare providers should avoid causing harm to their patients. They should be aware of the principle of double effect, where a treatment intended for good unintentionally causes harm. As is the case with beneficence, here too is an obligation to determine as far as possible the likely implications of our actions and consequently the risk for possible harm to our patients. And then lastly, justice can be divided into three categories: fair distribution of scarce resources or distributive justice, respect for people's rights, rights-based justice, and respect for morally acceptable laws, legal justice. And later on, I will explain more about how these were transgressed according to my interpretation of the Ombuds report.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Just before you go there, on page 5, you have highlighted certain guidelines in the books. Can you please explain those? Not necessarily in detail. What are they?
The majority of people who work in the healthcare professions in South Africa are registered with a professional body, and with the exception of nursing, who has their own council, and pharmacy have their own council, virtually all the other allied health professionals and health professionals are registered with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. So each of these three bodies that I referred to, and in particular the Health Professions Council, then in this case, have ethical guidelines for their professions. So we all, by virtue of the fact that you become a certain, take on a certain profession, you have a moral obligation to extend your ethical duties, and it has to fit in with the ethics of your profession. And these guidelines are not only for doctors, even though they refer mostly to doctors, they are for everybody that is registered with the Health Professions Council should be adhering to these ethical principles.
Thank you. Then we can now move to page 17, where you have applied the principles that you have just explained to us, to the facts that are before this tribunal.
Justice, through you, may I refer to page 6, please? I would like to just take us through ethical reasoning. Yesterday I was listening to Advocate Krause trying to follow a logical legal process, and I thought to myself, but there's a similar process that is followed. It should be logical, and you should make everything as clear as concise. So in one of the booklets, clear guidance is given as to how to resolve ethical dilemmas, and suggesting ethical reasoning is needed, which proceeds in 4 steps. First, you formulate the problem. Determine whether the issue at hand is an ethical one. Once this has been done, it must be decided whether there is a better way of understanding it. Secondly, gather information. All the relevant information must be collected, such as clinical, personal, and social data. Consult authoritative sources such as these guidelines, practitioner associations, respected colleagues, and see how practitioners generally deal with such matters. 3, consider your options. Consider alternative solutions in light of the principles and values they uphold. And 4, making a moral assessment. The ethical content of each option should be weighed by asking the following questions. What are the likely consequences of each option? What are the most important values, duties, and rights? What are the weaknesses? How would the healthcare professional himself or herself want to be treated under similar circumstances? And how does the healthcare practitioner think that the patient would want to be treated in a particular circumstance? So here I would like to come to and refer to the managers involved. The managers that are appointed as Director Generals and heads of the Director of the Clinical Directors, they are also registered. They are still registered with the Health Professions Council or with a professional council. And what I'm trying to understand in this process is there were ample warnings beforehand. So a decision was taken and then a process followed. During this process, at some level, the person taking some of the decisions was not a medical professional. So in between this person and the patients were a whole range of medical professionals. So things started happening. Letters were written. There were meetings. Letters were written by patient advocacy groups like SADC, by expert groups like SASOP. Court actions were implemented. So ethical reasoning should tell me that the health professions involved should then say, wait, stop, what are we missing? How should we think about this? Let's follow moral, ethical reason. What is the problem here? Let's gather information. Actually, people came and volunteered information to us. Let's consult some more. What could be the possible consequences of this? And then take this information to the next level of authority.
What is the duty of the health caregiver to impose ethical reasoning on herself, himself, before conduct? Could you say, I was assured, or my junior said, for instance, Dr. Silibano, the HOD says, oh, my juniors told me it was all hunky-dory, it was all fine. Now the question, the inevitable question is there a duty to resort to ethical thinking before acting, before providing health care or making decisions about patients and so on?
It sounds like there's two questions there, Justice. The one is before instituting healthcare, and the answer is yes, and then whilst instituting healthcare, and the answer is still yes. So even after the fact, so let's say a certain action has started to take place, and you get new information, immediately you can change the course of action. Again, if I can use myself as an example, I am a consultant in a psychiatric hospital. I have a multidisciplinary team around me. Every day we have to take clinical decisions, and in psychiatry it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between what is clinical and sometimes what is ethical, or there's a lot of ethical decisions that goes with the clinical decisions. Like, should I send a patient back home because this patient has a history of aggression? So we have to consider risk to the patient's family. So I would say on week one, at a ward round, I would listen to everybody. Everyone would give their opinion. So everybody meaning the doctor looking after the patient, the psychologist, the social worker, the occupational therapist, and the psychiatric nurses. And I would say this is the plan we are going to take with this patient. Then next week, the social worker comes back. So let's say, for example, in this situation, I was not aware of the gravity of the danger the patient holds towards other members of the family. And the next week, the social worker comes and gives me this information. I have to follow my ethical reason and say, whoa, okay, have we done everything we can? Let's reconsider this decision. Do we need more time to make sure that the risk is as minimal as possible before we send this patient out?
You see, Professor Grobler, we were confronted with evidence like, even from healthcare users, the decision had already been made. The horse has bolted. So I can't revise my approach to the health care that the user is entitled to or is going to receive. What was the ethical obligations there? One, was their duty to assess constantly?
Are you
Two, was their duty to prevent thereafter? Look, a decision was made to move mental health care users from one site of treatment to another place of care. And it turned out that the new site has a number of limitations. What ethical issues would arise? What would be the obligation of the healthcare giver?
When you say healthcare giver, are you referring, Justice, to the person looking after the patient in the hospital or the person involved in the decision-making?
Decision-making.
In terms of decision-making.
And that person is also a doctor or other form of healthcare giver.
Okay. Justice, I really cannot understand why a decision cannot be turned around. If you have new information, you should be able to say, stop. I mean, here you have a situation where patients are taken care of. They're admitted under the Mental Health Care Act. There's a multi-professional team looking after them. We know that here they're going to stay in, we don't even know if all of them have space. That this, between here and here, this is my understanding, that these managers were saying, you know, if a senior, and I don't mean to state this in a disrespectful way, but a manager should be saying, if the senior manager is asking, how's things going? They say, well, we're going to move them. You said we must move them. Have we got enough beds here? Maybe, maybe not. We think we have. Have they all been accredited? I'm not sure. Maybe they are. Make sure it happens. And in this process, so they're still living here. They're going to live here. External bodies, the families comes and starts worrying about where this is going. The professional body starts, SADC starts, and they start giving information. So now my opinion is that this manager has an ethical conflict. Should I listen to my employer or should I listen to my ethical conscience? Because my ethical conscience here, the evidence should be overwhelming. We should change the course of action. Yes, the decision has been taken, but no, they have not been moved out. And it's a simple word that should have been said, stop. Let's just stop what we're doing and say, everybody calm down, and then take this to the higher levels and say, listen, something is wrong with this picture. Where they are now and where they're there. Again, in terms of context, when we think as mental health care practitioners how healthcare is administered, taking a patient from here to here is not merely a matter of a bed and a roof over your head and food to eat and possibly medication. There's so much more involved in this. There's frequent follow-up. There is the input of occupational therapy or occupational therapy assistants. There is psychiatric nursing that has to take place, monitoring of medication, monitoring of side effects. There is follow-up that needs to take place at community mental health clinics or community clinics where the medication can be issued. And every time you issue the medication, you should be looking for symptoms of relapse. You should be looking for side effects of the medication. So we're not looking only at a roof over the head. We're looking at a whole big picture. And this was what SASOP was trying to say, if you read carefully what in their documents. This was what they're trying to say. But this picture is not here. You should stop. And in spite of that, the logical thing did not happen. Can I use an example of my own experience? There's a wonderful article recently published by Dr. Kiran Zukiri, who's an Eastern Cape psychiatrist, the National Mental Health Policy Framework and Strategic Plan. I know we're going to come back to that, but we can cover it now. The case of the Eastern Cape. And in that, he refers to the National Mental Health Policy Framework, and he also refers to a model called outreach, which he thinks can be incorporated, and basically says that there's no one-size-fits-all for South Africa, and I'm very well aware of that. So I work in the Eastern Cape. The area I cover is Nelson Mandela Metropole, Kakadu parts, and Sarah Bartman. I am, as of at the moment, the only psychiatrist left in that area, the public service psychiatrist left. I hope to get some help in the near future. So 2 or 3 years ago, since I've been there, I started doing outreach. So outreach means I take myself and a team of doctors, or sometimes just myself. I go to Humansdorp Hospital, Graafrenet Hospital, Somerset East Hospital. And I drive there in the morning, I see a number of patients, and I drive back in the evening. So I see patients that we see sometimes, or most of them we never see. Then I have sisters. I have a Sister Breiners in Klipplaat. I don't know where Klipplaat is, and I don't know what Sister Breiners look like. But myself and Sister Breiners have had frequent telephonic contact, and by virtue of that, we've been able to keep patients out of hospital. Klipplaat is something like 250 kilometers from Graafrenet, if I remember correctly. If a patient becomes ill in Klipplaat, the patient cannot go to Willowmore Hospital because Willowmore is not a listed facility. This patient has to go to Graafrenet Midlands Hospital. They have to be taken there by the police. At Graafrenet, they have to be admitted for 72 hours. Then they are transferred to our institution for admission. And once they're better, they go back to Klipplaat. But Klipplaat has the only support, psychiatric support they have at the moment is my outreach, which because of the shortage of doctors I used to do every month, I can now only do every 3 months. I go there, and that's their support. So that's an outreach model, and that was what Dr. Zukiri was suggesting for the Eastern Cape. And yeah, so if you look at the National Mental Health Policy Framework Strategic Plan, the logic and the research behind there is there's nothing wrong with it. It's a good plan. It will have to be differently implemented. So I started all of this by saying, as mental health care professionals, we don't only look at, is there a roof over your head and a bed to sleep in? We look at so much more around this person, and also the principles involved in the National Mental Health Policy Framework is
and
that
throughout that process, particularly there are changes in the site or the manner of delivery of health care. You say ethical reasoning has to kick in.
Yes. Yes, Justice. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Thank you, Justice. If we may then move to page number 17, Professor, we will come back to page 15 where you dealt with the framework policy. Let's start with the application of the...
Can I read again, Justice? Yes. With the aforementioned in mind and considering the rights of the patients involved as point of departure, the information available to me would indicate that the healthcare providers referred to in the documents, through their decisions, actions, and omissions, may have failed to adhere to the following ethical principles during the time leading up to and in the aftermath of the Life Esidimeni disaster. The guidance as to how to resolve ethical dilemmas through ethical reasoning as described in the clinical guides of good practice, as we just discussed, do not appear to have taken place at any stage. And we've already said that it's unimaginable that neither the court actions nor the warnings by the experts nor the concerned voices from within the Department of Health led to some form of introspection on the side of the healthcare practitioners involved in these decisions and review of decisions. The Ombuds report makes reference to staff members reporting stress and junior officials being put under pressure to do as directed because they did not agree with the decisions. So in terms of autonomy, a paternalistic approach seemingly assuming that patients were not able to give informed consent and hence not informed of decisions or choices being made that were going to impact on their lives. Neither the patients nor their next of kin appear to have been provided with an opportunity to make informed choices or decisions.
Well, in this case, in essence, the response of the managers, including managers who are registered healthcare users.
Healthcare practitioners.
Yes, was practitioners rather. Was that...
They might be users now.
Yeah. Yes. Well,
Sorry, Justice. Apologies.
Was that they had no option. They'd run out of money. And they had to change the place and the manner of delivering healthcare.
So then ethical reasoning would expect you to reason around the issue of distributive justice. And again, so my logic would tell me, okay, so here you have two managers that starts to realize something is wrong with the picture. So my logic tells me that they should go to their superior and say, this is not going to work. We don't have money. We can't keep them in there. And the understanding is that we need to save money. We have to look elsewhere. We have to look elsewhere. We cannot look here because this place, we shouldn't be saving money. And then what came out afterwards, I mean, the sums don't add up. 117 Rand versus 300 Rand versus 1,700 Rand. That does not make sense. Nothing there was logical to me reading from the information.
Assuming there is substance in the claim that there's no money, how do you deal with the autonomy requirement?
Again, then the issue is distributive justice, and they should, in my opinion, then they should look elsewhere for saving money. If the choice you have to make is patients are living here, we think that they will, we will save money by moving them there. You have not done it yet, but we think that we might be saving money. So we don't have enough money to pay for this. We have enough money to pay for this. Ethical reasoning tells you that you should then consider what the possible consequences would be. And the possible consequences, considering what we already know about this place, is that there will be deaths. I think at that stage it could have been foreseen. It was words like disaster was used, if I remember correctly. And then that trumps the money. Then the government has an obligation to say, okay, well, then we need to move funds to make sure that these patients are looked after. And again, I'm not an administrator and I'm not a politician, but that's for me the logical decision. Say, okay, let's go and look elsewhere to save money.
Thank you. May I proceed?
Yes, Prof, to the next one.
Beneficence.
Mm-hmm.
The actions and decisions did not consider the best interest of the patients, and harm was neither prevented, nor was the situation of the patients improved. There was a clear failure to consider whether the proposed actions would have been truly beneficial for the users involved, despite clear communication by experts in the field of mental health, which indicated that not only were the proposed actions not beneficial, but they carried a high risk of harm to the users concerned. Non-maleficence, expert advice was apparently ignored, and a course of action instituted that put patients at serious risk, resulting in death for some. So non-maleficence in this stage would have been to say, stop. Let's just not continue with this because the experts are telling us that a disaster is coming.
Even officials within the department.
Even officials within the department, if my understanding is correctly, yes.
And while you're there about officials in the department, where do we draw the line between clinical decisions and ethical decisions? See, Dr. Silibano sought to persuade us that he was no longer a clinician, and therefore his decisions ought not to be but an executive, an administrator. Mm-hmm. And his decisions ought not to be tested against any ethical code.
If he is not registered as a medical practitioner anymore, there might be a way for him to argue that point. If he's still registered, you cannot argue that way. So clinical decisions and ethical decisions, you cannot see them apart. They're always going to have an influence on each other. Let's take it one step further. Let's look at your institutional duties. So your institutional duties might sometimes be in opposition to your ethical duties. If you do not follow ethical reasoning, and that means that you have to get into conflict with your superior to say, I am not going to do A or B because of my ethical duty to my patient. And the clinician is then in a difficult position because the employer might say, well, then you are no longer employed by us. But if he listens to the employer and somebody else, a family member, takes this person to the HPCSA, ethics even trumps the law. So you can be found not guilty in a court of law, but by your own medical profession. If you have broken the ethical rules, you can still be found guilty and held accountable for that. So coming back to that remark, the only way he can get away from his ethical responsibilities if he was not registered as a practitioner anymore. If he still was, he has no choice.
Thank you, Prof. You also say that patients were failed in terms of justice, and can you explain that?
In terms of distributive justice, scarce resources were not given due consideration, and arguments for financial savings does not appear to have any grounds. Arguments towards financial benefits to relocating the users were short-sighted, failing to take into account long-term costs involved in caring for such users in the absence of adequate community resources. Rights-based justice, the basic human rights of the patients and their next of kin as enshrined in the Constitution of South Africa were not respected, and legal justice. There are a number of references in the Ombuds report alluding to violations of the Constitution and contraventions of the National Health Act and the Mental Health Care Act.
And also in light of the fact that there's evidence before this tribunal to the fact that the department did not ensure that service level agreements were signed before the patients were relocated. As such, no money was transferred to the NGOs on time. Some NGOs had to wait for 3 months to get paid by the department.
I read that. I saw that in the reports. Yes, Advocate. Can we go on then?
Yes, please.
And then, I know this has been mentioned a number of times, but I have to mention this again. The report of the Ombudsman refers to a number of human rights violations, including the right to human dignity, the right to life, the right to freedom and security of person, the right to privacy, the right to protection from an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, the right to access to quality healthcare services, sufficient food and water, and right to an administrative action that is lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair. Just as I have to stop here and say something about our mental health care users in the field of mental health.
That's not bad for a doctor. You sounded like a lawyer for a moment.
I'll take that as a compliment, Justice. I think I remember going to my first psychiatric conference in 1998 as a psychiatrist and expressing an opinion to a colleague of mine saying that there's still stigma involved in mental illness, and we should endeavor the rest of our lives, in our professional lives, to destigmatize mental illness. And unfortunately, this whole disaster, I think, at some level has to do with the stigmatization of the mentally ill and the dehumanizing of the mentally ill. And the fact that anybody could have thought that these actions were right or were not right at some point, did not question whether they were right, did not foresee what is going to happen to these patients, I think is testimony to a society that sees people with mental illness as lesser, when in fact we should be taking extra care of the most vulnerable of our society. And I hope that this arbitration process puts that in the spotlight, that we really should advocate, everybody's responsibility to advocate on behalf of the mentally ill and people living with intellectual disability.
Thank you, Prof. If you could then go to page 20 on the duties and roles that you would have expected from the officials.
A number of observations in the Ombudsman report alludes to possible conflicts between the institutional duties, legal duties, and professional ethical obligations of involved healthcare practitioners. For example, difficult for us as implementers, it was tough and very stressful, a culture and climate of fear. No one believed or bought into this rushed approach. Time was prioritized over the safety of users. Haste process with large number of users. Time frame was too short and impossible to do such a project. Voices of reason and advice not listened to, as such followed instructions blindly.
Well, that was the excuse that was given, that they were under pressure.
These were the excuses that I saw and that I quoted from the Ombudsman report. The result appears to have been that healthcare practitioners abandoned their ethical responsibilities to the patients due to a culture and climate of fear and blindly followed instructions. It is not stated what or whom these managers and junior staff were fearful of. And I'm just going to highlight one or two or three of the duties of the patients as referred to in booklet 1. They did not apply their minds. Number 2, they did not apply their minds in terms of considering the appropriate treatment of the patients. 3, they did not respond appropriately to protect patients from risk or harm. 6, the patients were not listened to. In fact, nowhere in the documentation provided could I ascertain that the patients were at any stage consulted. The concerns of their next of kin were not listened to nor respected. 8, the principle of informed consent as an ongoing process was not applied. The healthcare practitioners, seemingly one by own admission, according to the Ombudsman report, did not acknowledge the limits of their professional knowledge regarding care, treatment, and rehabilitation of those with severe mental illness.
Yes. If we could now go to page 23, where you give an opinion about poor record keeping, in particular discharge and supersession of the patients.
Okay. Poor record keeping, I'm just going to refer quickly to that. There are numerous references in the Ombudsman report regarding to poor record keeping and data management contributing to poor decision making by healthcare professionals involved. healthcare practitioners' responsibilities regarding keeping of patient records and alteration of records as described above in the reference to booklet 9.
Yes, and in particular, that patients were moved without files. They had no medical records when they moved to the NGOs.
That is something I still don't understand, Justice. In our province, we move patients from our institution sometimes to an institution in Fort Beaufort called Tower. Every transfer takes place with a full history and a full documentation with a report from the doctor, a report from the social worker, a report from the occupational therapist, a report from the psychologist. That person, and we have a Life Esidimeni, a life healthcare facility called Kirkwood Care Centre in Kirkwood. So if a person goes to these facilities, they stay under the Mental Health Care Act. So they were admitted to us under the Mental Health Care Act, and they go there under the Mental Health Care Act. If we send them home, we discharge them from the Mental Health Care Act. For that, a form 03 is filled out, Mental Health Care Act Form 03, if they discharge. If they go to these institutions like Kirkwood Care Centre, they need a Form 16, which is a High Court document. Once they discharge from Kirkwood, they need to fill out an 03 again. And I cannot see and understand from this process how they went from Life Esidimeni to these NGOs and what the due process was. What happened to their medical information? What happened to their files? Were these people given medication? Where were they going to get medication? The whole process does not make sense to me.
Professor, what is the impact of numbers here? You know, when you normally do transfers, how many people would be involved? How many patients would be involved? It seems to me there's detailed record keeping and work that has to be done in respect of each patient.
In general, Justice, it's not more than 5 or 6 at any given time. I have to say here, there is something that I have expressed my dissatisfaction in our province, and it has not happened again. But at some point, we were given an instruction to, and the word that was used was decanting. And I really took exception to the word because it's a dehumanizing word. Because of the pressures on beds, and there's a long history to that, and I'm not going to draw the Eastern Cape into this, but I have expressed my dissatisfaction with this. There's a long history of not listening to the healthcare professionals, even there, at least our managers are engaging with us to say that the problem is not creating more hospitals. The problem is not enough facilities in the community. And then when the pressure starts building up in casualties in the area, then everybody starts getting upset. And we are forced to send patients out to Kirkwood and to Tower, and they call and to Kumani was the other hospital, which is in Queenstown. And this was on one Friday, we had to transfer between 20 and 30 patients. And then, but we still followed the process. We had to write reports the whole day. We had to send the information along. And the process then that followed is, we will not do this again. This is dangerous. But there was an instruction.
Here, Professor Grobler, nearly 1,700 people displaced, I'll use, within like 3 months, between something like March and May, large numbers. Let's go back to record keeping. How do you properly, proficiently keep records, discharges required by the law, and have the paperwork done, and then move these people to another institution where repetition of the paperwork more or less has to happen? Was it possible at all? And should the managers have anticipated that there will be a real problem in moving large numbers of people from one institution at the same time, i.e. over 2 to 3 months?
Justice, I agree with you. It's impossible. I think it's humanly impossible to move that high number of patients and make sure that everybody has the necessary reports, that the professional this side was consulted, that they were told about the conditions of the patients, that they had the necessary medication. I don't think it's possible.
And did they have any chance to move the records with the patients in an orderly, systematic way, given those numbers?
My common sense would tell me, Justice, that it would have been impossible. I cannot imagine it.
And did the officials should have known that, surely? Any people exposed to mental health care, record keeping in hospitals or facilities should have known that it would be near impossible to have the records track the patients.
I think the records and the process of discharge, I think we cannot forget that there's a statutory process that needs to have been followed, and that, again, for the life of me, I cannot think that the Director of Mental Health Services would not know that.
Thank you, Justice. In actual fact, the evidence that was laid by the officials before this tribunal was that the process of discharge was not followed. Some try to say that it was not a discharge, but it was a transfer. What is your view on that?
That does not make sense at any level. That's trying to get away with words. These places are not statutory places, in my opinion, if my understanding is correct, where you can admit somebody under the Mental Health Care Act. So for them to go from here, where they're under the Mental Health Care Act, to here, where they are not anymore, it's a discharge. It's not a transfer. If it was a transfer, this place should have been able to give exactly the same service as Life Esidimeni, and they should have been statutory. There should have been things to say that they can admit people under the Mental Health Care Act.
Just the last point on that one. Also, it would seem that the patients were not assessed, in particular by the treating doctors when they left Life Esidimeni. I see that on page 24 of your report, you made reference to an affidavit by Dr. Talatala. Can you just read it out, please?
On page 24, in the affidavit of Dr. Talatala, who was at the time the president of the Society of Psychiatrists for South Africa, he states that a foundational principle in care of people with severe mental illness is that only a psychiatrist who has been treating the mental health care user should perform an assessment of that mental health care user for the purposes of discharge. There should be no circumstances in which a doctor is called in to discharge another doctor's patient. The reason for this is that while there will be notes on a mental health care user's file, a doctor other than the one who has been responsible for the mental health care user does not have sufficient information or background to be able to conduct an assessment of a mental health care user for discharge. We refer to a case of one doctor assessing and discharging another patient as supersession. The HPCSA guides are clear on the issue of supersession. A practitioner shall not supersede or take over a patient from another practitioner if he or she is aware that such a patient is in active treatment of another practitioner, unless he or she takes reasonable steps to inform the other practitioner that he or she has taken over the patient at such patient's request, and establishes from the other practitioner what treatment such patient previously received, especially what medication, if any, was prescribed to such patient, and in such case the other practitioners shall be obliged to provide such required information. In this case, again, what seemingly has happened, there were doctors involved this side as well in Life Esidimeni.
Yes.
Here, I cannot see where the doctors were involved.
In one of the meetings, the minutes record that patients should be discharged from Life Esidimeni to the NGOs, and that the doctors from the department will follow them and assess them at the NGOs. Would that be proper? It's in one of the minutes of the meeting that was held in the department prior to the removal of patients from Life Esidimeni.
Again, I did not read that, Advocate Ntlantla, through you, Justice, but that does not make sense because these people are working for Life Esidimeni, the doctors that were looking after them at that point. What should be happening, there should have been community health clinics around these NGOs where they could have gone and where doctors sometimes might be. I don't even know if they would have been doctors. So they seemingly, in my opinion, went from a place where they had access to doctors at a reasonably short, if they needed it, to a place where if they needed a doctor, they would have had to travel.
It seems like the department was under pressure, so they didn't have time to assess them, to ensure that patients are assessed before they leave Life Esidimeni. And therefore, they decided that the doctors from the department would follow them and assess them at the NGOs. Would that have been proper?
The doctors from the department?
Yes, not from Life Esidimeni.
Sorry, Justice, which doctors from the department? The
clinicians within the department.
Which clinicians? I don't understand because the clinicians involved were Life Esidimeni employees, if my understanding is correctly. I'm not sure which clinicians took them over, except if they went to the psychiatric hospitals. And again, Justice, I apologize. I don't know all of the information. I've been trying to follow, but
your opinion is, as an expert, is sought on whether it was ethically and clinically proper to have patients discharged from Life Esidimeni under the pretext that they will be assessed by provincial clinicians when they arrive at NGOs. Is that something permissible? May it be done that way?
Well, if they follow due procedure and they discharge them correctly here, that means that the doctors in Life Esidimeni thought that they could be discharged. They sign a form and they discharge. So now they're not under the Mental Health Care Act. Now there are no doctors looking after them. So that doctors that they refer to, I don't know who that will be. I'm sure it's not the managers. So are they referring to the doctors at the community mental health clinics? Are they referring to, I know that Gauteng has some community mental health services, are referring to that psychiatric clinics, but they will have to travel there, and they will have to make contact there.
But the tragedy, Professor Grobler, is that when these patients reached the NGOs, there were no doctors, let alone psychiatric nurses. In most of the places, there were cleaners, there were other category of workers, but forget about psychiatrists, forget about doctors who are not psychiatrists. There was no clinical staff, or any note, certainly where the places where most deaths occurred. What is that? Isn't that an egregious violation?
I cannot...
Ethical and clinical violation?
It definitely is, Justice. I cannot begin to say how wrong this looks from the outside, looking at this inside. Due procedure was not followed, and they didn't put, the department didn't put enough thought into what goes into the discharge or what goes into the process of deinstitutionalization. I know that some of them refer to deinstitutionalization and said, but that's what the policy says. It is clear that they don't understand what deinstitutionalization means and what it entails.
You see, Dr. Libet, Dr. Silibano, Dr. Manamela, certainly the two, Manamela and Silibano, want us to accept that they had thought the plan through, and therefore they had no reason to anticipate the deaths. This what we've told you now, that is their plan. Is that a safe-proof plan? Is that a plan that would have ensured that lives are not lost? Move them from here, Life Esidimeni. Let's assume they're discharged by doctors, because the evidence is that they ordered Life Esidimeni to discharge the patients. let's assume for a moment they were properly discharged. All of those patients were taken to places where no clinicians were available to admit them, assess and admit. And they say that's their plan. And that plan makes them not to be culpable. They couldn't anticipate the harm that resulted.
Forgive me, Justice, but can they read?
Well, they share the title doctor with you, I think.
Justice, they were warned by the, and it's not my place to find them guilty or not guilty, but I'm defending my profession here. The psychiatrist told them, so if on what grounds and in what authority could they say that they've thought this through, apart from the ethics, just in terms of what does deinstitutionalization mean? So I can't understand how, how would they think that they know more or better than the psychiatrist that sent them this letter. It wasn't only the SASOP, it was the heads of departments, it was SADC, people who are experts. They didn't listen to them. They have Prof. Melvin Freeman, they have the National Department right under their noses. They didn't consult them. They are world-renowned experts. So it does not make sense that they say they thought it through.
But to top it off, the MEC who was in charge was here yesterday, and she says she trusted and believed the plan that these clinicians told her they had put together. Was she entitled to trust a plan like this, which has just been described to you?
Justice, that's a very difficult question to know whether she was entitled to trust the plan. She's not a medical practitioner, if I'm understanding correctly. I think she's an educator. But as an educator, at some point, again, coming back to myself, also as a manager, I am a clinician, but also a manager. If new information comes to you, you need to consider the information. And if experts come to you saying that there's going to be a disaster, you need to take a step back and consider the evidence. If I was in her shoes, if I have to think this through logically, and I have two managers coming to me and saying, we thought this through, one is a doctor, one is has a doctorate in nursing, but I'm not sure how much psychiatric experience they have. And here on this side, I have SADC, SASOP, Section 27, court action. I need to weigh the two and say, okay, is this a plan I can trust? As the person responsible, it still does not make sense that you then go through with this plan, blindly trusting then the two people below you.
Thank you, Justice. Just the last point, Prof. On page 24, you made reference to patients' rights that you believe were violated. Can you please take us through that?
In terms of the National Patients' Rights Charter, it appears that all the following rights of the patients concerned were violated: the right to a healthy and safe environment, the right to participate in decision-making on matters affecting one's own health, the right to information regarding treatment and rehabilitation to enable the patients to understand such treatment or rehabilitation and the consequences thereof, the right to provision for the special needs of disabled persons, the right to a positive disposition displayed by healthcare providers that demonstrate courtesy, human dignity, patience, empathy, and tolerance, the right to health information that includes information on the availability of health services and how to best to use such services, the right to be given full and accurate information about the proposed treatment and risks associated therewith, and the right not to be abandoned by a healthcare professional who or a health facility which initially took responsibility for one's health without appropriate referral or handover.
And then you've given an example of your personal experience on dealing with ethical dilemma.
There was a situation in our hospital where over the years, for some reason, our hospital was forced to admit patients on the floor. So even though they were coming from another institution from a bed, we were instructed by management, top management, not at the hospital, but even beyond that, that we have to admit the patient. And this came to a boiling point a number of times during my tenure there. And then at some point, so we were running on an average of around 30 patients on floor beds, basically an extra ward in our hospital at some point. And then one day, it came to a point where we ran out of mattresses and 2 patients had to sleep on blankets on the floor. And the next morning, the nurses and the doctors took a stance and we phoned the managers in Bishu and we said, we shall not continue doing this. And even though they might discipline us. And they never did discipline us for that, and that it was changed therefore, and other plans were put into place.
Professor, is there any connection between stigmatization, dehumanization, and public service notions of whether resources ought to be spent on mental health care? You know, you seem to see a pattern. Only state psychiatric doctor in the Eastern Cape, I mean, a certain area of the Eastern Cape, you must sit and say, is there a public service reluctance to use resources on mental health care users? And is that part of a stigmatization and dehumanization? What is this? Why is it that there's such an obvious, seemingly obvious scarcity of resources on mental health care users?
Justice, I think it has a lot to do with stigmatization and the fact that mental health is not seen as a priority, and the mentally ill is not seen as a priority by our managers. I was at a meeting at the beginning of last year where the National Department of Health came down to the Eastern Cape and they asked what has been done to implement the National Mental Health Policy Framework and Strategic Plan. That was what the meeting was about. So all the senior managers were there. And they basically had egg on their faces because none of the plans had been instituted in spite of many psychiatrists, including myself, saying what we think should be done and can be done in the province. There's an inertia in moving when it comes to mental health. In fact, I feel that we are regressing. So this one manager looked at Dr. Eva Malutsi from National and said, after she said, but you haven't done all these things, he asked her, but is it a train smash? And she looked at him and she said, yes, it's a train smash. They don't see the train smash coming. They don't seem, and I agree with you, there's a pattern here. And the pattern has to do with stigmatization and looking down on the mentally ill.
Thank you, Justice. That would be evidence in chief. Thank you, Professor.
Yes, thank you. Advocate Hassan.
Thank you, Justice. Good morning, Professor Krobler.
Good morning, Advocate.
My name is Adila Hassan, and I represent, together with my colleague, Ms. Steyn, families of the deceased. I just have some questions, not too many for you. The first question is in relation to, you refer to the letter of SASOP, the June letter, 2015, and you say you agreed with the concerns.
Yes, I did.
And one of the issues that arose...
Sorry, Justice, I don't have that specific letter. I know there were a number of letters, and I agreed with the content of all the letters that I saw. I'm not sure which one specifically you're referring to.
Can I put in front of you, if you so wish, we can very quickly get it to you.
It's in LR2, the exhibit bundle LR2. and it's page 47.
Sure.
Sorry, my LR2 doesn't have a page 47. Oh, there you go. Yes, I have the letter in front of me.
Thank you. So this letter is addressed to the former MEC for Health, and it's in relation to the reduction of beds at Life Esidimeni. There were two phases to this project. The first was a reduction of beds over time, a 20% reduction. And then it turned into what the department called a marathon project, and what they referred to as decanting of mental health care users. But if we just start with the first phase, you see the letters that come from the clinical heads that you referred to, and even from SASOP, were concerned even before the marathon project. They were concerned with the 20% discharge. And the reason they were concerned is, one, the capacity of the communities to absorb, but that you could also not make these decisions en masse. And I'd just like to get your view on that.
Advocate, I agree with you wholeheartedly. What they saw, in my opinion, and again, I'm making an assumption here, is that they were worried here that there are going to be a 20% reduction in beds. That 20%, when you're working in the public service, you're wondering where are these patients going to go? Are they going to go to the public service hospitals, which are up to capacity full, so there are no beds there? And then, or are they going to go back into the community where you know there are inadequate resources and inadequate services? So it's a catch-22 for the clinicians involved, and that's what I would assume would have been their concern. So even the start of the project, they would have already worried and say, okay, yes, but this is going to be an extra burden on the community resources, and it's going to be an extra burden on acute psychiatric services, which we do not have a buffer to absorb.
So would it be fair to say that the risk was present even before the marathon project began?
Yes, it would.
The other concern that was raised by the psychiatrists was that this, apart from the care and the impact on the individual mental health care users, was that it would escalate costs. So I'm here referring particularly to your reference to the principle of distributive justice. How does that make sense to you? How would you, the psychiatrist warned that this would in fact escalate costs.
Again, I'm going to work from the assumption what I think they saw, but because I'm in a similar position, I can make that assumption. They knew that there were not support in the community. So what they would have foreseen the risk to be is that these patients are now contained, they are well cared, they are stable on medication. You send them elsewhere where you don't know whether they're going to get their medication, where there's a change of environment, a change of staff, where they won't have the psychological and nursing support with what they've always had, which would predispose them to relapse. So if they relapse, they're going to end up in the acute psychiatric service. Here it costs 380 or 70 rand, I can't remember. Here it costs 117 rand. Yes. There it costs 1,700 rand, and that's pretty much the average in our own hospital as well. So the maths is not too difficult. So, and already from the start, another thing I don't understand was that from the start of the planning, they said they're going to move some of the patients back to the state service, and the heads of departments expressed their frustration with that decision as well, because they knew they didn't have capacity, and it doesn't make financial sense either to send them from a place where it's 400 Rand to a place where it's 6 times that amount.
So your reading of their reason is correct, and I just want to take you specifically to the letter, which is a couple of pages before the one you're looking at, the letter of the clinicians, page 44, under the heading Financial Implications.
Yes, I see it.
Have you seen this before?
Yes, I have.
So the purpose of it is to say, let us spell out for you what the financial implications are, or could be, of
Yes.
this readmission, relapse, and so on.
Yes,
And so you're in agreement with those opinions.
100%.
Regarding I would like to come back again to the issue of this decision, but let's just go to the transfer. Dr. Talatala told us that even the process of transfer of patients has to be very carefully managed. Do you agree? And what do you understand by that?
Yes, Advocate. The process of the transfer, let's start with the patient. The patient needs to be informed. First and foremost, you need to have a conversation with this patient, regardless of their level of understanding, to help them understand that they're going to be moved to a different place. Then you need to explain to them the reasons for that and what circumstances they're going to be under, because you are trying to take away the fear, and you are trying, it's a therapeutic process, you're also trying to preempt their anxiety, because the anxiety will rise going from place A to place B, especially when you've been institutionalized and you're used to the same people, the same routine, day in, day out, month in, month out, year in, year out. So you have to negotiate, not even negotiate would be the wrong word. You have to manage this with the patient itself. Not only the doctor, also the psychologist, also the OT, also the psychiatric nurse. All of them have a duty in that hospital to start with the patient and explain the reasons and so on, if there is a beneficent reason to move a person. So even if it's with the best intention and it's going to be better, you still have to follow that procedure. Then there's all the administrative responsibilities in terms of writing a report on the history of the case, so that the next person accepting this patient understands when did this illness begin, what is the age of the patient, what is the profile, what are the medical conditions, what is the medication that this patient is on, are there certain medications that they're prone to side effects, what should I not use on this patient. So there's a whole list of medical issues that I can think of that I would like to, my colleague taking over this patient, know about. And the same for the psychologist, and the same for the psychiatric nurse and the OT, and so on and so forth. And the social worker needs to say, this is what I've learned about this patient's circumstances. Otherwise, all of this will have to be done from the start. And we are dealing with patients that, I'm making an assumption, but have been there for years. There's a long history that took them to that point. It is not 1 or 2 lines. We're talking long reports. So just in terms of that, it's a huge process to move the patient. Then we always involve the family where we live. We go to the family. We ask the family.
Let me come back to that in a moment, the issue of the families. Okay, so at this point, I'm just talking about the transfer.
Yeah. Then you have to arrange the transfer itself. There's a legal process involved there. If it's under the Mental Health Care Act, there's a Form 11. If they discharged, there's no legal process to be involved, but you need to arrange the transport. You need to preempt any problems whilst being transported, because, again, different decisions, different illnesses, patients with different illnesses will react different to the stress of just being transported. Remember, they might not have driven in a car for years before that point. And then once they're there, there's a whole process to
On the point of that, on the transportation, if we just
Well,
want to break...
on that point of that, may I interrupt you and Professor Grobler? It's 11:34, I think.
My apologies, Justice.
Clearly, there are matters to be canvassed with Professor. So we're going to, and he has earned the right to some tea, given the work is done up to now. So we're going to take I suggest the tea adjournment now, if it's okay, and then we resume at 12 o'clock as we always do. But as we part, let me just tell you here, there's a bit of cattle heading.
I saw that, Justice.
Yes, there was nobody. I mean, that's part of the tragedy of this, this inquiry, this arbitration. On the other hand, there was just simply nobody to receive these patients. Forgetting how they were discharged, how they were transported. And they got to the other end and there was nothing. There was Siabadinga, there was Precious Angel, there was, name them. Enka and what. That's what they got the other side, just about nothing. Came with a little few belongings and no proper records, no clinicians, nothing. So what you are telling us is very, very helpful for us to understand what should have been in place.
Thank you, Justice.
Shall we resume at 12 o'clock? Very chat.
entails, the transport entails. So the families are never excluded from the treatment, the care and treatment of the patient.
Thank you. Doctor, we act for the survivors. They are mental health care users in the sense that they can either be intellectually disability or having a mental illness. And although we've consulted with them, we haven't called any of them to testify. The opinion that we've received so far is that it could be detrimental to the treatment to appear here. Would you go along with that? That it could be detrimental to the treatment?
I would go along with that because I think one should be very cautious there. So I would ask the clinicians involved. And again, when I say clinicians, I refer to a whole multidisciplinary team who each have an opinion. Like you guys disagreed this morning on something, you can have the same at a multidisciplinary team meeting where the social worker says also, or the psychologist, but I have reservations, and you have to listen to that opinion. So to put a survivor through this process, I think would, again, depending on what the illness is, I think would be very difficult for such a person, and I would be very cautious to ask a person to come and testify here.
Thank you. Doctor, if I can then move on to the relapse principle. You've dealt with lots of this already, so again, I'm going to try not to, sorry, it's Professor, not to repeat what has already been said. But what we have in case of most of the survivors were people that has been institutionalized for a long, long period. So if we can go from that backwards, if such a person who had reasonably good treatment with a multidisciplinary team are all of a sudden placed in a place where there are no professional staff, there's not sufficient food, there's not sufficient water, or they don't get sufficient water, what would the effect of that be on relapsation?
On relapse?
Yes.
Again, in a situation like that, and reading through all the documents, I can only try and put myself in the shoes of such a person. So when I'm in institution A, may I use the word, I'm fairly happy and content. And then suddenly one day, and I'm using this, I'm explaining it in this way so that everybody in this room, I think, has the capacity to have this kind of compassion. The next moment, a truck or a bus or whatever arrives at the front door, I am told that you have to get on there. I've never seen this place. I don't know how much information has been shared with this person. And then I'm taken to a place and suddenly I'm out of my routine. The beds are different. I can just imagine, gauging from the reports, what the conditions in some of those NGOs might have been. So let's say I'm mildly mentally ill and I have to go and stay in a situation like that. That already would have been devastating for anybody and would have been stressful for anybody. Now I put somebody with a severe and enduring mental illness there. And then comes the other unimaginable things that we read in the report, like there is no food, there is inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate security, protection. That's an extra level of stress that you have from the outside. Inadequate clothing and access to warmth. I mean, it's devastating. It would be devastating for a mentally healthy person, even more so for a mentally unhealthy person.
Yes. And if we add to that a mental health care user are not properly identified and getting the wrong medication or not getting medication at all, what effect would that have on the relapse of this person?
That is something we haven't even...
Justice? Am I just allowed to intervene at this juncture? I tried to restrain myself on the aspect which I've been canvassed with this witness. The issues relating to relapse of the mental health care users are beyond the scope of this witness, as he is clearly called here to deal with aspects of ethics in relation to those who are in charge of the mental health care users.
I'm startled by the objection. A professor of psychiatry, qualified as a doctor, has a PhD in psychiatry, worked in state institutions for many, many years, and is being asked about relapse. And his evidence is that clinical and ethical responses are intertwined. They're that tight and close. Why wouldn't the witness be competent to express an opinion about a relapse of a mental health care user?
My concern is that the report and his purpose before these proceedings is to deal with matters of ethics of the professionals who take care of the mental health care users. And he's not here to deal with matters relating to the conditions of the users themselves. I'll be in your hands, Justice.
Yes, I don't know how you could talk about ethics without evaluating the kind of care and decisions that were made in relation to the care of mental health care users. Let's look at the report. I mean, Professor Grobler goes on to apply the ethics on the conduct of clinicians and non-clinicians who were involved. Isn't that a legitimate inquiry? Whether or not you feed mental health care patients is a clinical and ethical question, isn't it? The duty not to harm. The duty to do good to patients. The duty to protect their lives. I'm not even going to ask the other colleagues to respond. I think the objection is not upheld. Continue.
Thank you. Professor, the question was if you then misidentify the mental health care users or give them the wrong medication or no medication at all, how will that impact on a possible relapse?
Excuse me, Justice. It will have devastating consequences. If a person who suffers from epilepsy is not given their medication, they will, within days, probably start having seizures, and that could be life-threatening. If a person without epilepsy is given somebody else's medication, that could cause toxicity and could cause serious harm, and that's only for epilepsy. And there are other psychotropic drugs that have other side effects. So if you're going to give the wrong medication for the wrong person, that will very quickly escalate, or not give patients their medication, that will very quickly escalate into a disaster.
And anybody working with these mental health care users should foresee this could result in death. It's just so logic that you don't even need to be a mental health care user. We don't even need to treat them to know this, isn't this so?
And Justice, yes, I think this is something we haven't even touched on. That's just the medication and the transfer of medication. Even when we transfer to a place like Tower Hospital, we provide 2 or 3 days for medication just to make sure that they do have access to medication, that they have the same medication available. So if you're going to blindly send somebody elsewhere without knowledge of their diagnosis and the importance of their medication, which medication they're taking, that is a disaster waiting to happen within hours.
Yes. And the person would relapse or die. That's the bottom line.
Death could be possible, yes.
Now, we also have evidence here in the documents that the local clinics were overloaded and they couldn't deal with another overload of mental health care patients. You probably know a little bit about that, and I still want to speak to you about that in terms of the mental health policy, but if the local clinic is overloaded, and that is seen as the primary source of medical attention, what is the logical conclusion to be reached there?
Again, I think this is what the psychiatrists and the concerned groups were trying to highlight, that they know what's going on in their communities. Some of their patients already live in those communities and have to take advantage of those clinics available to them. In as much as the professionals in the big hospitals knew they were going to be stretched if they got new patients, judging from the reports, I think that they also knew that if you put X amount of patients in a certain area because they're familiar with the area and they know what the level of services is, they're going to know that those persons will be stretched because it's suddenly a new burden. And in the mental health policy framework, that's one of the things that they refer to, is that you have to, before you consider deinstitutionalization, you have to first build the services within the community, the support services, the community mental health care teams, the community mental health teams, and the healthcare centers, and integrate psychiatry into that and make sure that there's access to medication. And that's a complicated process. So it doesn't come as a surprise to me that they were not equipped and not ready for this influx of patients.
And then you have the fallacy of people thinking that all medicine is available at local clinics. And we know in terms of the formulary that was already placed before this court in cross-examination that there's different levels of medication and you wouldn't necessarily keep them at a clinic. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. Certain medication can only be prescribed by psychiatrists or people working within psychiatry. So, and that's the case even in our area as well. And that is a challenge in our area because our resources are dwindling, our human resources are dwindling. The community is feeling the brunt, but they haven't put things in place to have these prescriptions signed and re-signed. Remember, these prescriptions have to be repeated every 6 months according to law.
And see the patient.
And the patients need to be seen and reviewed and reassessed.
Yes.
Excuse me, Council. When you sit in an NGO with no doctors and other health caregivers, how do you get a prescription? How do you get further medication? How would a patient possibly be medicated?
My understanding was that the health Department of Health expected that the local clinics, the normal primary healthcare clinics, that the medication will be available there and that they will be available for the patients to go and access their follow-up and their medication there. That was my understanding of
but
their
Professor, in
understanding.
that scenario, how do you generate a script?
That's a very good question, Justice. If you have no doctor, there should be at one of the clinics at least a doctor. So you should have then a referral document that states which medication you are on. Nobody at the NGO, if there's no doctor there, can prescribe that medication. So this person needs to be taken then with a script to a clinic where there is a doctor, and this doctor can then transcribe the medication and see the patient and make sure that the patient gets monthly medication. If the patient came without a script, this doctor will then have to review this patient. And a normal psychiatric interview takes about an hour, just the first interview, and that's on average. It's sometimes longer. So this doctor at this clinic who's already having to look at a primary healthcare level, having to look at 50, 60 other patients that day, is now suddenly confronted with an extra burden of psychiatric patients whom he or she knows nothing about. So they have to review, find out its expert level medication that they're on. They're going to have to phone the hospital to find out which medication and which dosages they're on. So if there's not access to a specialist in the community, that's another disaster.
Thank you, Justice.
Thank you.
Doctor, I'm going to move off from the relapse now, and I just want to speak to you briefly about the suffering. And this is not only psychiatric, you're also a medical profession. If a person is not given food, and some of the people die of that, what suffering would you go through, even if you don't die at the end? What happens in your body without food?
Advocate, that's a very good question.
You haven't thought of it in many years.
I haven't thought of that in many years, but just considering if I would put myself in their shoes, and I'm a mental health care user, firstly wondering why I'm not getting the same treatment, and then the anxiety that goes with being hungry and not getting the nutrients that you have, and then that's starting to escalate, that you're not getting the nutritions that you need, you're not getting the fluids that you need, and we know that there's a high comorbidity between people with severe enduring mental illness and medical illnesses. So they're more prone to medical illness like diabetes and high blood pressure and high cholesterol and kidney diseases. And some of them are on medication that affects their kidneys. So suddenly if you are not given the necessary nutrients and fluids, your electrolytes will start becoming imbalanced, and you will start physically suffering as well. And then you can go into what we call a delirium, and that's a medical condition.
So you're back at relapse with that?
Well, then that's actually a more serious place than relapse. When you starting to suffer from a delirium, that's a medical emergency. Then you need medical attention first before you attend to the psychiatric illness.
Oh, yes. And if a person that can't help themselves to know I'm now thirsty, not given water, and we have people that has died of dehydration, what suffering will that cause in a person that has not died?
Again, I don't know what the different diagnosis was of the people involved, but a severe intellectually disabled person might become more and more restless, might start screaming and acting out more, or become aggressive. A mental health care user, most of them should be able to say, but I'm thirsty, I'm hungry.
If they can speak.
If they can speak. And if they're told, well, we don't have water, or you can't have access to water now, they will become angry, and they might have aggressive outbursts. And that will be then construed as, oh, maybe he's just acting out, where in fact he has the right to be angry at that point.
Yes, we have received evidence of a mental health care user saying, I'm thirsty, and the carer said, no, he can't have water because he wets himself. What would you say in terms of suffering? What would that do to a person?
That's just unacceptable. I mean, that is not care in any way. One cannot construe that as care.
Yes. Can I just also ask you, normally a mental health care user has difficulty to adapt in society if he's not institutionalized. Would you agree with that? After institution, if he's deinstitutionalized, there is a problem of adapting.
Yes, if it's deinstitutionalized. So the process, what you're asking, Council, is the process of having lived in an institution for a long time and then having to go into the community to live there. Is that your question?
Yes.
When I worked in Ireland for about 2 years, and I was specifically involved in growing up in County Donegal in Ireland, in the northwest of Ireland, their plans, helping them with drawing up their plans as to how to deinstitutionalize the last of the patients that were still institutionalized in the psychiatric hospital there. And there were about, I think if I remember correctly, about 40 patients. it was about 3 years of planning, just writing it, and then they put a team together to do that. They also had other services like daycare centers and halfway houses and assisted living centers where a person would go from the hospital. So let's say we're going to deinstitutionalize patient X. So this patient tomorrow or this evening is taken by a team to live with other hospitals in assisted, in a hostel, let's say.
Do you need something to write on? Are you, or are you fine? We have something for you to write on if you want to.
I can write if you want to.
I see that you're struggling to do justice. If I may, we have arranged a board for the professor to write on because he.
I don't necessarily need now. I could just quickly mention then the services available. So there would be a building, a house where they are taken this evening. Psychiatric nurses will go and check on them this evening. Are they okay? Tomorrow morning a bus will come and take them to the daycare center. There they will get lunch and dinner, and they usually make breakfast, if I remember correctly, for themselves, but always under supervision. So that's assisted living, and every day all those people comes to a daycare center at the hospital. So that is the responsible way in going about deinstitutionalization, and I don't think one should go about it any other way than in that way.
Because there's social cost involved in putting somebody that's not adapting into society. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
And we have sometimes aggressive people. We've had families testing about it. We can't keep them because they're aggressive. That has a social cost to it. Do you agree?
I do agree. And what we've seen also, and there's an article by Professor Kaliski to this effect as well previously, that we start seeing if you deinstitutionalize in a haphazard way and prematurely, we start to see that psychiatric patients or mentally ill patients are criminalized. So they don't have the access to care and the care that they should have in the community. They commit crimes. They may become paranoid and throw stones through people's houses or assault people in the community. And then they end up in the criminal justice system, which is also wrong. And it's because we're not taking care of them in the community.
And the person's window that was broken, that's an economic cost.
Yes.
Yes. Let me just ask you, we've talked about a lot about the stigma, so I'm not going to go there. But often, between the stigma and the difficulty to adapt, we have people being discriminated against, and that discrimination leads to inhuman treatment or to a barrier to human rights. Will you agree with that?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Council, please?
Yes. Often, when you're stigmatized and you're not fitting in socially, then there's a barrier to your accessing human rights or to you being treated inhumanly in society. Would you agree?
Yes, there's a barrier to care. So when you're stigmatized and you feel stigmatized by the community, you would not seek treatment as easily as somebody else would, or not find out about the treatment. So there's definitely a barrier to care. I didn't quite understand the second part.
It's just that there is an inhuman treatment for you then, because people don't want you around them, so they don't treat you humanly good, and often people land up on the street.
Stigmatization has that effect, that people are dehumanized. They're seen as nuisances in the community because they might do odd things, or they behave in an odd manner, or they might look odd or dress oddly.
The reason I'm raising this with you is that there are still, as far as we're concerned, missing mental health care users, which we don't know what happened to them. And people treated in this way, there would be terrible suffering for them. Would you not agree?
I would agree.
Also, in just sending people home, you're not really having a mechanism to create the autonomy. That if there's not a basis for them to to receive care, they can't really be autonomous. Do you agree? Or seek towards the drive towards autonomy?
Again, Council, sorry, I'm not following quite your...
Maybe I should just repeat that. If you want to send people home, there must be necessary infrastructure to help them to be autonomous. You can't just dump them. Do you agree?
Yes. Yeah. Well, to function, I'm not sure autonomy would be the right word there.
Yes, maybe I should say to you, the Umbud said it was necessary to promote principles of autonomy in deinstitutionalization. You would agree with that?
Yes, in the sense that they should have been part of the process and have been consulted in the process.
Yes. The Umbud also said that living conditions, there must be improved standards of living conditions for mental health care users in the community before you just deinstitutionalize. Would you also agree with that?
Yes, most definitely.
Okay, do you have the National Mental Health Policy and Framework strategic plan in front of you? Or should we provide you with a copy?
I have a copy.
Justice, that's LR 124. If we went there yesterday, and I know the numbering were different on the LR than on the blue cover policy. I'm going to refer to page 23 of that policy. It starts by a heading by 2020. Do you have that in front of you, Doctor?
I do.
Sorry, Professor. Now, this says under 1A, B, and C, it says mental health services must be developed further before downscaling of psychiatric hospitals can proceed. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Is there sufficient development in the community at present in South Africa as far as you are concerned?
In my opinion, no.
Do you know of any mental health workers in the field, healthcare, mental
health assistance?
Yes, in the field at all.
I've never seen one. I know that there's a term for mental health assistance, but I've never seen one in our, not in the Eastern Cape.
Can you please turn to the previous page in the policy? That's a triangle. You see that?
I do.
Now, it seems to me this is the same triangle that the World Health Organization uses, and we've just adopted it over from the World Health Organization.
I'm going to assume that it is, yeah.
Now, it seems to me that all our patients were in the top of this triangle, long-stay facilities. Would you agree?
Yes.
And then, if you could show us perhaps on this diagram, where did they go to from there?
Now I will, can I just show you, or do you want me to draw?
Do you want to draw?
Let me draw.
I'll try to put it on record,
Oh, yeah.
yes, as he draws. Just.
You sensed my concern.
You must please just turn your board that the Justice can see he's the most important person here. Thank you.
Council is obviously wrong. It should face that way. They are the most important people.
Professor, you have to take your microphone with you as well, if you don't mind.
Don't have enough hands. So this is institutionalized care here, where they
Oba
will...
King can hold the mic for you. Oba King, just hold the mic, the professor, and he can use.
So this would represent long-stay facilities and specialist psychiatric services, and then you would have psychiatric services in general hospitals here, and community mental health services here. And then it goes to primary health care services, informal community care, and self-care. So by self-care, we are going to assume that this person can live independently. But all of these should happen simultaneously. Well, actually, all of these. So if you're asking what level were they in when they went to the NGOs, in a sense, they were in between here and here.
In between the informal community care and self-care on the triangle.
Yeah, yes, in terms of where they were living.
And the logic of taking somebody from the top of this to the bottom, does it make sense?
It doesn't. Again, I want to qualify here. It depends on how you are going to plan your community mental health services. So if you plan your community mental health services to have daycare facilities and assisted living facilities, so this we will call assisted living facilities. So it depends on which model you use, but if you're going to argue that, well, this is a community mental health service and it's assisted living, then you're moving them from there to there.
Yes.
What in reality happened is that they moved down there and that this was absent and this was inadequate.
Professor, so in terms of what our policy says, before the second tier from the top is not developed, we should not deinstitutionalize.
That's exactly what the policy says, yes.
So, and in terms of accepted international norms, it is accepted that if you deinstitutionalize, you will go to the second tier and not down to the bottom. Would you agree?
Yes, and then have a very good service there with assisted living and daycare centers and halfway houses.
But the second tier, excuse me, the second tier, does it also consist of institutionalization?
Again,
what is a community mental health service?
I feel quite out of my depth here, Justice, I have to admit, because you have one of the experts in the country here, Prof. Melvin Freeman, and I'm left to explain this, and I wasn't involved in drawing up this, so I'm interpreting it in terms of my own experiences. So you might need to...
Professor Freeman must raise hands so that we can identify. His name is all over the record. Hi, Professor Freeman. Good to see you, sir. Okay.
Can I just then continue? So we can say this wasn't done in terms of the accepted international norms.
Can I sit down?
Past there, Council. I wanted to understand that first step down. What did it consist of? Will that be institutionalized service?
Between the still working. Again, it depends on the model. So if you have assisted living here, and here you have independent living.
Can we just put that on record? You're showing this the second tier, and then you move down to the last tier.
If you have assisted living there, this is a service that is being rendered. It's not a housing plan or a housing product. So I'm assuming you're referring to where they live. So going from an institution where they live to assisted living, what you're referring to, to maybe community living in a halfway house. So again, there I'm creating my own model now, a halfway house, to independent living, possibly. That is the process that you're aiming towards for deinstitutionalization.
But what would NGOs approximate?
They would
formal community care?
No, I would consider them as assisted living because they are still, in a sense, then institutionalized. They are permanently living in a place where other people are taking care of them on a daily basis.
But that can only work if the NGO is up to the standard that it should be.
Yes, but it's still not, Justice, I think you're making the point, is it not still institutionalization? Yes, it would still be institutionalization in some form.
What is primary care service for mental health care? What is that?
Primary health care service have been incorporated in mental health care service. So that is a clinic where you have, let's say, nurses, where a patient can go with any problem. So the person has mental illness, but they have a cold, then they go there for the...
So that does not connote occupancy or institutional living, no?
Not to my understanding in this.
The model deals with services rather than where the patients live.
Yeah, this model specifically, yes.
But in order to get to the last tier, the previous models must work. Do you agree?
Yes,
the previous tiers must work.
Yeah, this is what the policy framework says. This and this must be developed.
And we know now that the primary care, the clinics, those wasn't, they were already overloaded.
That seems to be the case, yes.
And we know the NGOs, all the patients is being taken away from them.
Pardon, say that again?
All the patients is being taken back to Life Esidimeni after this process.
I was not aware of that.
Yes. Thank you, Doctor. Can I just ask, how are we going to, and I'm now talking to the future, because this is...
May I sit down, Justice?
Could I ask that somebody just take the barrier between the justice and the witness away?
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to speak to the future, Professor, because one of the things that our clients need is to be sure that this does not happen again to them, that they're not the next victim if this happens again. So how must deinstitutionalization happen to ensure that a mental health care user won't die?
We have experts in our country who have been giving this a lot of thought and thought for a long term, Prof. Freeman being one, and the other being Professor Crick Lund and Professor Alan J. Fleischer. And they've written extensively on this topic. And I have in front of me an article published in September 2009, a model for community mental health services in South Africa, where they did a costing, amongst other things. And I'm sure that this might have had some, might have been part of the planning process for the National Mental Health Policy Framework as well. And I know that they're involved in that. So I'm saying that there are a lot of experts. There are experts in this field that have been studying this for many years, academics. There are clinicians like myself that has been working in the field that knows what is happening at the grassroots level. And as Dr. Zakiri said in his article, there's no one size fits all. We need to go about it and in a systematic manner. There should be a template for the whole country to follow. That's what national policy should be about. And then different provinces will probably have different needs in terms of the community that they serve, and even in different parts of the same province. But you can change the model here and there, and you need to know what it's going to cost in terms of human resources. You must know which professionals you want to be part of that model that you're adhering to. So whether it be community mental health teams, which professionals are going to make part of that community mental health teams, assisted living, primary healthcare services, who should be working at which tier of support. It's not rocket science, in my opinion, to put it together. It's a lot of common sense, and there's, where we are in South Africa, we're not going to make 2020, definitely not in the near future.
So what you're saying is by 2020, we won't be at a place where we can deinstitutionalize safely. Is that what you're
Certainly
saying?
not in the Eastern Cape.
Okay.
And
the Eastern Cape was part of South Africa the last time I checked. Yes.
To do something now, and I think something should be done now immediately, we have to be pragmatic. We have to think out of the box. We have to consider people with qualifications that are not utilized by the government. People like mental health assistants that you refer to that needs a two-year qualification. That's like they're on their way to becoming psychologists, if I can put it that way. Then after, if you do another qualification, you become a, what is the next one?
Counselor.
A counselor, then a psychometrist, then a psychologist, and depending on which master's degree you do there. In occupational therapy, they now have occupational therapy technicians, OTTs. In medicine, they have clinical associates that has a 4-year degree. All of these people can be used. In fact, in my province, I've been begging for the past 2 years and say, send me 10 clinical associates. Walter Sisulu trains clinical associates, WITS trains clinical associates, University of Pretoria trains clinical associates. Send me 10 clinical associates per year, and I will turn them into mini psychiatrists all over the province, and I can render a service by communicating with them directly. They will not be able to sign scripts, but they can sign scripts together with prescriptions, together with professionals out there. In Somerset East, for example, we trained a doctor in a diploma in mental health last year. So she looks after the patients there for me. So we have to be pragmatic, and we have all these people with skills, but we're not utilizing them in mental health, and I definitely think we can use them in mental health. Just as a last remark, I spoke to Prof. Jani Hichu from the University of Pretoria just recently, and in Pretoria specifically, they have, I think he said, 11 clinical associates who are running their substance abuse program in Pretoria, where they see the substance abuse. I'm not sure how it works. I have very little information in this. But they're using clinical associates there, and I can see this. We can do the same in other parts of the country.
What you're saying is there's ways to do what we have to do with less money than we want to spend. That's basically what you're saying. There are people around that we can utilize that are not psychiatrists to drive processes.
We're talking about, there's a nice term for that. I can't remember the term now, but reskilling or upskilling or...
Yes, upscaling.
Upscaling. You know,
or skilling. Oh, sorry, yeah. Yes.
So we need to equip other people to do things where we know there won't be a psychiatrist. And that it is possible to do that.
Can I just take you, are you aware that the Health Professionals Council in 2008 made, you spoke about the mental health assistant, and that they'd need a qualification of a 2-year or NQF6. You spoke about that earlier.
Yes, I'm assuming that it's at a similar level as the OTTs.
But there's no process to accredit these guys as yet. So what can we do about that? Do you know?
Again, I'm not a policy maker, and there are expert policy makers even in this room, but we need to think pragmatic, and we need to use these people, and they're going to cost less than what we're spending at the moment, and we just need to think smarter. So I think it's doable. I think we can, for every province, create a different model. Dr. Zakiri was talking about an outreach model that I was referring to, because we're already using that to some extent in the Eastern Cape. So every province can look at it differently and look at their needs. And an urban area like Gauteng obviously would be very different from where I'm working in the Eastern Cape.
Yes, the Health Professionals Council has a a mental health assistant in their framework. They also have a registered counsellor. But this plan that the policy, and I take it what you say, you didn't draw the policy, but both those occupations are absent from the health work policy. So on the one side, we have a professional counsel say, these guys could be useful. The policy doesn't make use of them. So would you say there's a need for these people in mental health care, assistants and counsellors?
Yes, there's a need, and I can start using them tomorrow in the area where I work.
So we have the need on the one side. Then we sit with the fact that there's not a process of registering them. So that's something, we must look to that. The mental health profession, or who else, do you know?
I'm very close to where
I'm very nearly finished.
Mutama was.
Yes. I'm very nearly finished,
Yes, we're
Justice.
setting up a whole curriculum of psychiatry about which we can do little, but more frankly, nothing.
And I, with respect, Justice, not nothing. We have still a country full that, and I'm very close to the conclusion now. If you just
No, that is fine. And I'm saying that in an arbitration award, how much can you write about how the training should be and how those trains should be deployed and their characteristics? That's all I'm saying. For the current purpose, it might be sufficient to say we need mental health care training. We need the experts to go and look again and to formulate capacity, how to build capacity. I don't know whether one can go beyond that.
if you grant me 5 more questions, Justice, I'm done with this.
Yes.
What we have a need. We have a clear lack of process. And then on the other side, we have university students studying at great expense to themselves and their parents psychology. Do you agree?
I saw that in the
papers.
documents that you gave me, yes.
Yes. Now, we know that about 200 less psychology students than law students qualify per year. Now, law students have a career path, but those guys don't have a career path. Would that be true?
That is my understanding, and that is something that the psychologists themselves will have to look into.
Yes.
And in terms of their scope of practice, I know that they have been looking to some of that between clinical psychology and counseling psychology, but they need to look further down the line. And the point you're making is that they need to look at mental health assistants and psychometrists and counsellors as well, and I agree with that.
I've asked you before your testimony to look at LR 90. Do you have that in front of you? And I'm stopping with this.
I don't have mine.
LR 90 is 90.
I have it in front of me.
If you can turn to page 6 of LR 90. LR 90 is an affidavit that was placed before the arbitration. The witness was not allowed to testify. If you can just go to paragraph 16 there on page 6. Would you agree, if one looks at the Ombuds's findings, that there's definitely a need for more skilled resources? You've said that, the Ombuds have said that. You agree with that?
I do, yes.
Now, the conclusion reached by Ms. Campbell was that South Africa has a substantial existing skills base from which to be drawn, but graduates have a little opportunity to be formally recognized in the Department of Health, and the skills remain inaccessible. Would you agree with that?
It would appear from the documents and from her career path, definitely so.
Yes. The problem with having skilled people, not having a place for them to practice, create people practicing without the oversight of professional bodies. That's a logical conclusion. So what is the problem to practice in the mental health field without an overarching body to which you're responsible?
Again, we're talking here about a psychologist, and I'm wary of stepping on any toes because it's outside of my profession. But I would think that the danger would be that they are going to become entrepreneurs in a way and start rendering some service, maybe a cash service or something of the sort. I suppose that would be one.
Or doing harm.
Avenue. I suppose that could also be possible, yes.
Yes. So what you're telling us, you could use more help, and so would all state institutions at the moment.
Yes, and again, one has to qualify and then say it has to work according to a very specific plan that was put together by academics and clinicians, and that there's adequate funding to put people in place, and there's a...
My last question. It's my last question. This. So, would you agree it's time that the universities, the Medical Health Council, the policymakers start speaking to each other?
I think it is.
Thank you, Justice.
After this hearing, if they don't, I would be deeply surprised, but thank you, Advocate Krauser. Advocate Willeveld?
Thank you, Justice. We have no questions for the witness.
Yes. Advocate Witamo?
Similarly, Justice, we have heard the professor. We have no questions.
Oh, okay. Re-examination.
Thank you, Justice. There will be no re-examination.
You've been quiet for so long, you should be having something to say. But very well. Professor, we've developed a practice and we have been quite consistent. Let me start off first by thanking you for coming out to this part of our country. And come and help us with an obvious challenge that happened in the Gauteng province, but which I suspect it might be a national, if in some senses, not a global challenge. How to provide adequate mental health care in ways that we've seen all of these wonderful codes. But thank you for coming out and sharing it with us. It's very, very important. But it's also important for the families who are here. You can see they're all here and listening. And those who don't follow English, all this gets translated in the language that they hopefully follow. So that is my way of saying thank you. And the report is very useful and will be used. I'm sure you'll see your own sentences somewhere in the judgment, in the award.
Thank you.
So thank you. We do allow all witnesses at the end of a hearing like this to express themselves. It's obviously not obligatory. It's not like a question, but it's something that you might want to say in the light of what you know now about the Life Esidimeni tragedy.
Justice, if I may then, I don't think I'm going to say this, but I think I would be amiss not to express my condolences to the families of the patients, the deceased patients, and to, in a sense, say that I've done my part as well as an advocate for those with mental illness. I recently, in last year, I published a letter to the editor in a magazine called the South African Journal of Bioethics and Law, in which I referred to my own brother who I visited the beginning of last year in the UK, suffering from colorectal cancer. And I have to say that I have his permission to I had his permission to publish this, and also the artist. So what happened is I went over there, and within the first day I realized that he was significantly depressed, suicidally depressed. And it took me 5 days in the middle of London to get my brother help. I'm a psychiatrist myself. I was chased away by psychiatric hospitals, by secretaries at psychiatric hospitals telling me, asking me if I'm in the system, if my brother is in the system. 5 days before I could get my brother access to mental health care, and this is in London. So I think this is a global problem, and I'm referring to an artist because an artist friend expressed something about the plight of mental health care users in a painting that I later on bought. So I do want to express from my side my condolences to all the family members, and our thoughts and our prayers are with you. Thank you, Justice. Nothing more.
Again, thank you. Yes, we're going to have to confront the scourge of dehumanization and stigmatization, and look how far it has brought us to a very terrible space where we don't want to be. We thank you again, and indeed you are released. There'll be one or two housekeeping matters we're going to deal with. If you want to sit there, you're welcome, but we're going to thereafter adjourn very shortly. Once more, thank you, Professor Grobler.
I will be happily sit here until you're finished.
Yes, no,
Thank
thank
you.
you. We've come to the end. It was your witness, Ms. Advocate Ina.
Thank you, Justice. That will be the last witness for today. Thank you.
It's the last witness for today. That's good news indeed. Would any of the council want to say anything?
Justice,
We've settled
sorry.
the next 2 days of sitting, which on Tuesday and Wednesday will seem to be agreed. If not agreed, at least it is settled. We know what we're going to do. Is there anything else that we want to say?
Justice, from our side, I'm very sorry that I'm going to keep you up for a little bit longer, but I have quite a number of affidavits that I want to hand up, if I might just read them into the record.
Oh, yes, certainly.
As LR 139, an affidavit by Grace Leah Mothlabi. It's one of the family members. LR 140, Musidi Priscilla Nchangaze. Similarly, all of these affidavits are by family members. LR 141, Sandra Ronita Davis. LR 142, Lupir Bertha Hasim. LR 143, Onika Dalasile. LR 144, Jim Tlamini. LR 145, Pumla Shahi. LR 146, Thalita Olga Mabisela. LR 147, Sophie Kanza. LR 148, Mojalefa Sewunya. And those are the affidavits that we will make sure it makes its way to all the necessary files. Thank you, Justice.
Very well. Thank you ever so much. Is there anything else from any of our council? No. We are done, at least for now. And where I come from, we say fast bait, because we left with 2 more days of hearing and 2 days of argument. So the end is in sight, Sasha Stevens. You've been with this thing forever, almost going to grow old on it, girl. Be careful. But we got in there, we're almost there. So I'd like to again thank everybody and the family and the media. I've never talked about the media, but you've been amazing. Whoever I meet says that they've been watching your coverages and crossovers, so it has been quite amazing. for so many days that you would run this thing live and to tell South Africans about something that might have been ignored, about mental health care users. So in many ways, it was a very big thing to counteract the stigma, to say mental health care users' affairs and fate are worth reporting on live on television. So I'd like to thank you and the media houses who have been doing this, as well as on YouTube and just about everywhere. Thank you. I hope it will have some value for our nation and for the world. I know BBC and CNN have covered this in a variety of ways. So I hope it was something that will awaken our humanity. On that note, I would like to adjourn until Tuesday at 9:30. We're adjourned.